As we reported earlier, Mitt Romney says Florida Senator Marco Rubio is being vetted as a potential running mate in the presidential election. Romney says reports that Rubio is out of the running are, quote, entirely false.
Senator Rubio is with us now from Washington. It is his first interview since these comments. He has just published a memoir. It is called An American Son. Senator Rubio, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on, especially at this moment. When you heard these reports that you were not being vetted, were you already being vetted?
Well, I've made a decision a long time ago not to discuss the process, and that's not going to change today. I respect the process that Governor Romney's going through. You know what I'm pretty confident of is he's going to make an excellent choice, and I think those of us who are involved in politics and supportive of him should give him the space to do that. So that's a decision I made a while back, and I think it's the right one, to just not comment on the process.
Okay, but I mean...
But I knew you'd ask.
Indeed. So the question is, what happens when you're vetted? I mean, you get a questionnaire. What else do they do?
Well, I'm not going to discuss the process. I have a new book out. I don't know if you heard about it, though.
Allow me to talk about the book and then come back to some political questions. So
okay,
what do we learn from this memoir, An American Son, about you that might be instructive to understanding you and your political life and the things that made you who you are?
Well, the book is largely the story of my family and how many of the conclusions I've reached and the opportunities that I've had are the direct result of decision experiences that they made and had so long ago. And obviously, I think there are a lot of other people out there that have similar stories. And one of the things I hope is that by telling my story, I can pay tribute to America, because I realize that I've had opportunities that my parents should have had, but didn't, because they didn't have the blessing that I've had to be born and raised here in this country. There are also some things that I think will be applicable for people of my generation. I mean, in terms of the life-work balance, and I talk openly in the book about how I worry that sometimes I don't get that right. And I share mistakes that I've made, decisions I made and a while back while I started out in politics that I wish I had done differently, because I would have avoided a lot of headaches for myself. And I hope that that is something people will look at as well. And finally, I hope that people out there who are thinking about an endeavor, whether it's politics or business, and are being told that they can't win, would read the story as an example of someone who was told that once too, came to believe it himself for a while, was really discouraged. But I'm glad I stuck with it, because now I have the honor to serve in the Senate.
Your story is also about immigration. The title even suggests that, American Son. The president has proposed some new rules about what he thinks immigration reform ought to be. Do you approve and support what the president has said?
Well, I view that issue the way I outlined in the book, and that's that immigration is a difficult issue. Both sides, I think, oversimplify it sometimes. On the one hand, I think it's important to recognize these are human beings whose stories are stories that we should have compassion for, including the young, especially the young people who came here through no fault of their own. By the same token, we have a broken legal immigration system, and we have a very serious illegal immigration problem. And any solution to that problem, whether it's to the kids that have been here for a long time or to the people that are here and have overstayed visas, there has to be a balanced approach to that. And I think what the president has done, although I know it's going to be welcome news for these kids that are desperate for a solution, I think the way he did it, by ignoring the Constitution and ignoring the Congress, is going to make it harder for us to come up with the kind of balanced solution that I was working on and others were working on with me.
Mitt Romney has refused to say whether or not he would reverse the policy of the president. Do you know why he's not answering this question directly, and has he consulted with you at all on the issue of immigration?
I have not had a conversation with him since the president's decision came out, but from what I've read in his public comments, they echo the things we have said, which is these kids and their circumstances. These are young people that came when they were 5 years old, have lived here their whole life. They're the valedictorian of their school. It doesn't feel right to deport them. So I think most Americans would want to accommodate them, but it has to be done in a reasonable, responsible, balanced way. That's part of a long-term solution as well. And I think what I've read and seen Governor Romney say is that the way the president did it is going to make it harder to find that kind of balanced long-term approach. So we're going to continue to work on this. Obviously, I think it's going to make it harder to do it before the election, because we've lost some of that sense of urgency. I hope I'm wrong, but let's see.
But it's reasonable to say that the Governor Romney's positions on immigration as expressed in the campaign are at odds with your own deep feelings about immigration in this country.
No, I don't think that's true either. Like what I have said is I'm a big supporter of a legal immigration system. We need to remind everybody that 1 million people a year immigrate to the U.S. legally. No other country in the world comes close to that. There are 50 million people or so waiting to come into this country now. We get hundreds of people a year in our offices who are asking for help because their relatives have been waiting in line doing it the right way. What do we tell them? Come illegally, it's cheaper and quicker. On the other hand, if you meet some of these folks who are here under these circumstances, your heart breaks, because they are doing what most of us would be doing if we were in the same situation that they were in. And so I think that has to be balanced in a way that takes into account the human element of the story, but also the fact that, you know, we are a pro-legal immigration party. We are a pro-legal immigration nation. And I think that's what Mitt Romney has consistently said, especially since the primary started really getting going in January of this year.
It sounds to me like, though, Senator, that you agree with what the president is doing. You would like to see the Congress do it.
Well, I think there's no secret that we were working on a plan to help accommodate these kids. I think the plan we were working on was much more comprehensive, much more balanced, had much more detail in terms of some of the unintended consequences of this policy. But what I fear is that by politicizing this issue, by linking this issue to election year politics, it's now going to get harder to do the kind of balanced, reasonable approach that these kids deserve. And I actually discussed that in the book, and I wrote it well before this decision was made.
There's a lot of talk about what can and more frequently what cannot get done in Washington these days. Former Governor Jeb Bush, who I know you're close with, spoke to Charlie on this program about the need for some sort of a grand bargain or a compromise. It seems we always hear both sides pointing the finger. Wouldn't this be a good opportunity to step up and be perhaps the person or the party who starts to do away with the obstructionism, even if it may seem like that's contrary?
Well, I think there's always room for compromise on ideas. What's much harder to compromise on is your principles. And I think what we have now today are two parties that are so far apart on general principles about what the role of government is in America and in the world that it's difficult to have a compromise. That's going to have to be decided in an election. And in many ways, that's what this election is about. Now, I do talk about in my book a lack of urgency, and especially at the end of the book, if you read it, you'll see that it talks a lot about the sense that there's no urgency in Washington, irrespective of where you fall on these issues. There's no urgency. I mean, there's no sense of urgency, for example, in the Senate about tax reform, regulatory reform, the long-term debt, the lack of an energy policy. I wish there was more urgency, irrespective of how you feel about these issues, so we could start to have the debate that people deserve.
But the American people feel the urgency. Why is it that people in Washington, but why don't people in Washington feel that urgency? Can you help that in any way if you're there and you talk about it?
Sure, and that's why I do shows like this and hoping to prod people to understand it's not just about being right on the issue. It's about having the willingness to begin to deal with it.
But isn't it about prodding your fellow lawmakers if that's where you see the problem?
Well, and that's what we do today. I mean, I do that in my speeches. I do that in my private conversations. And too often I think what I hear back is, well, let's get through this election cycle. If we get through this election cycle, and then things will be easier to get done. I hear that on issue after issue. The problem is there's always the next election cycle. There's elections in this country every 2 years at the federal level. If that was the premise that we used, we'd never get anything done.
Senator Rubio, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, was on this program, and he said he's in favor of a grand bargain, and that he also thinks it has to do with entitlement cuts as well as revenue. Are you in favor of the same thing that your leader is in favor of in the Senate?
Well, I'm certainly in favor of additional revenue to government. That's not the debate, though. The debate is, how do you get the revenue to government? I think you get it through growth. The Democrats, many Democrats, and those on the left believe you get it through higher tax rates. I'm more than happy to have that debate. I think if our economy grows, that generates more revenue. It's very simple. I believe that we need more taxpayers, not more taxes. And I think that's the only way, by the way. Growing our economy is the only way that you're going to get a grip on this debt. You cannot tax your way, and you cannot simply cut your way out of this situation. You've got to grow your way out of this, and then you've got to have the fiscal discipline to make sure that that revenue is not being used to add more to the debt.
Senator Marco Rubio, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
The book again is called An American Son. It is 7:39. Here's a check of your local weather.
Good Wednesday morning. Howard Bernstein here on this very steamy Wednesday morning. Temperatures already into the mid-70s in many areas.